Naman Navats, Naman Navats, Naman Navats, Naman Navats, Naman Navats, Naman Navats. Well, good morning, everyone, or good afternoon, depending on where you are. I, too, am pinch hitting today for Reverend Jerry Hirano, the director of our Center for Buddhist Education. He had to conduct a memorial service at one of the 4 temples that he takes care of as a minister. So just filling in for him, but it's my privilege to be able to introduce our speaker and sort of be our moderator for today. Reverend David Matsumoto is one of my closest friends and colleagues in the ministry. We studied together in Japan at Ryukoku University. You know, I can honestly say Reverend David really studied. I mean, he studied so hard. I studied a little and I played pachinko in Japan, but the benefit of Reverend Matsumoto's intense study is now shared through his lectures. He studied so hard and came to really appreciate the depth and the breadth of Shin Buddhism and Shinran Shoning's teachings. Reverend Matsumoto, after graduating from IBS here in Berkeley, went on to Japan and studied at Ryukoku University, where he received a master's degree, came back and served as a full-time minister at the Stockton Buddhist Temple and at the Berkeley Buddhist Temple. And I think, you know, serving as a minister really influences his approach to Shin Buddhism as well. Then he began to teach at IBS while serving at the Berkeley Buddhist Temple, and then became full-time at IBS. And then also during that time worked on his PhD with the Ryukoku University. I don't know how he did it, going back and forth to Japan, and he received a PhD from Ryukoku University and now serves as president of the Institute of Buddhist Studies, really helping to establish IBS for its long-range future. And enrollment has gone up. IBS is really coming along tremendously. I was able to watch his first 2 lectures on SHINJIN, and now he's going to begin another 2-part series. So today it will be on SHINJIN and birth, and on May 6th, if I could announce now, May 6th will be the second of another 2-part series, and he'll be talking about SHINJIN and skillful means. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce Reverend David Matsumoto to give us his wonderful lecture and presentation today.
Thank you very much, Reverend Harada, for your very kind introduction. Reverend Harada and I have been friends for a great many years. He's been always so wise and so kind, and I'm so happy that he's now the Bishop of the Buddhist Church of America, doing a fantastic job. As you mentioned, we used to study a lot together in Japan. In fact, I think my introduction to Donran, his commentary, was through a study class I had with Reverend Harada, which was many years ago. But we've been through many experiences, both in Japan and in the U.S. And so it's a pleasure to be able to share today's event with him. I also want to thank Reverend Jerry Hirano, the director of CBE, and all the CBE staff for inviting me to be a part of today's seminar, and also for allowing me to continue on in our discussion of SHINJIN. As Reverend Harada mentioned, this is the 3rd part of what will be a 4-part series, basically. And I'll just turn on my PowerPoint now, and we can explain a little bit more of what I hope to do. So this is the title of the talk, SHINJIN. So as Reverend Harada mentioned, there have been 2 parts given previously, and I really thank CBE for putting them up on their YouTube channel. The first part, SHINJIN Part 1, we took up the topics of the nature of SHINJIN and the arising of SHINJIN. And then SHINJIN Part 2, we looked at what I call the implications of SHINJIN. And in particular, I shared with everyone some of my thoughts on a topic I call exposure and embrace, a life of Shinjin. So we're not going to go over these two topics again. Basically, in many ways, they sort of serve as the foundation for this talk and the next, but I will summarize it if I could. So basically, a review and summary of parts 1 and 2. We took a look at Shinjin, the nature of Shinjin, and I was mentioning that in my understanding, Shinjin and Shinran's thought evokes a broad range of religious meaning, everything from a simple faith in Amida Buddha's vow to an ever-deepening experience of awakening within the unfolding of wisdom and compassion in our lives, and ultimately to none other than the fulfillment of Amida Buddha's vow mind itself. While Shinran describes Shinjin in a variety of ways, he never tells us how to realize Shinjin. He says Shinjin is given. It comes about not through our own designs, but wholly through the power of compassion and wisdom. True and real Shinjin arises when we hear the name of the Buddha. As we call out Namo Amida Butsu, we come to realize that we're actually hearing that name, which is searching for us. And Buddha as name reveals itself to us, allowing us to know the significance of enlightenment. And as we awaken to this ongoing activity of enlightenment, in which wisdom unfolds as compassion for the sake of foolish suffering beings, we also truly know that Buddha's vow mind is fulfilled in each instance of the arising of Shinjin in this world. The Buddha's vow mind becomes fulfilled when we are exposed and emptied, even as we find ourselves embraced and enabled to live with a deep sense of interconnectedness and gratitude for all existences. The arising of Shinjin is the arising of wisdom, realized as we are exposed within the Buddha's light. Our false claims to independence, agency, ableness, and omnipotence are exposed and emptied within the light. It is exactly in that emptying that there arises the possibility of being able to know ourselves and live genuine lives. And at the same time, we find ourselves embraced and enabled to live our individual and communal lives. We awaken to the reality of wisdom and compassion in all existences and find ourselves able to be participants in the activity of wisdom and compassion in our lives, so that we may seek to take the Buddha's vows as our own and practice compassion with a deep sense of interconnectedness and gratitude for all existences. So that's a summary of, I think, what we covered or tried to cover in parts 1 and 2. Today, we're now moving on, based upon our discussions in part 1 and 2, to another topic, Shinjin and birth. And I'll talk about that very shortly. And as Reverend Harada mentioned, on May 6th, we'll have another talk, part 4. We'll take up the topic of Shinjin and skillful means, which is more or less a continuation of today's talk. And then sort of the overarching theme for both of the talks is Shinjin and liberation. And I'd like to then spend the final moments together with you discussing that. So that's what we have in store. So last time we talked about what I call the implications of Shinjin. I use that term intentionally rather than like consequences or results, that type of thing. But what does the arising of Shinjin imply? And I think there are many issues that we find within this. But today we're going to talk about 2 of them. One is the immediate attainment of birth in this life and the significance of birth in the Pure Land. So what is this relationship between Shinjin and birth? It's kind of interesting. Long ago when I first came to IBS, and I remember we had a series of special lectures from a very well-known professor from Japan. Some of you know his name, so I won't mention the name. but he gave some very profound lectures. And I remember after one of the lectures, we were sitting around having lunch with him and talking, and being a real novice about this whole thing, I asked some really sort of simplistic questions. And one of my questions was, will everyone be born in the Pure Land? Will everyone be able to attain birth in the Pure Land? And the professor sort of looked, and he didn't say anything. He said, no. He said, for instance, my sister-in-law, she won't be born in the Pure Land. To which I was shocked. I said, what are you talking about? He said, oh no, she never had Shinjin. In his mind, she never had faith. She never had faith in the vow. So she wasn't born in the Pure Land. And I remember thinking to myself, okay, well, this is a real interesting statement. First of all, how is he able to make that statement? How does he know? Has he died and come back? Is he aware of these things? And why is he making such sort of this very sort of absolutist blanket statement? If you don't have faith, you're not going to be born in the Pure Land. If you don't have Shinjin, you're not going to be born in the Pure Land. What does that mean? And why was he saying that? So that just really piqued my curiosity. And I've thought about that incident for many, many years. And so it's sort of, in many ways, sort of propelled my interest in trying to understand more about Shinran's teaching of Shinjin and birth. But I've come to realize it's a very complex question, this relationship between Shinjin and birth, because it operates in a number of different levels or dimensions. There's a historical aspect to it as we look back upon the Buddhist and the Pure Land Buddhist traditions, a textual aspect as we read Shinran's works and the works of others, institutional, and institutional orthodoxy finds its way into this question, as well as our own personal spirituality, our own communal spirituality, I guess you might say, issues of society and ethics, and this sort of becomes an issue in this world of religious plurality, including many other dimensions. So it can be a very complex question if we think about it in that way. And so today, as I had in the previous two lectures, I want to suggest that we'll approach our way of trying to understand or interpret Shinran's teaching of Shinjin and birth through a hermeneutical approach made well known by the French philosopher Paul Ricoeur, which has conventionally come to be known as the three worlds of the text. The three worlds of the text are the world behind the text, the world within the text, and the world in front of the text. So the world behind the text refers to the historical, cultural, societal context within which the author composed the text. So in the case of Shinran, it looks at both the Buddhist tradition, the sutras and commentaries, the Pure Land tradition, as well as the teachings and the experiences that he encountered through his teacher Honen, etc. All of the context out of which the text has been written. The world within the text refers to the structure or the language, the genre, terms, translations, and syntax, or the very content of the text itself. It means opening up that book and looking at it very carefully, very analytically. And the world in front of the text refers to the reader's perspective, the reader's needs and biases, the reader's concerns, the reader's actual present context. Now, what does it mean to me, to us, sitting here today, encountering this text? So all three worlds of the text operate simultaneously, and depending upon our own approach or our own sort of biases, our own sort of tendencies, we may choose one or the other, we may focus on one or the other. But I want to suggest that we'd like to move ahead, sort of taking this approach in mind. I have to say, having said that, today we're really going to spend a lot of time in the world within the text. This is going to be a very heavily textually focused sort of talk today. So my apologies in advance. And I don't know why I put this in here, but this is sort of an admission. So just as we are sort of unable to identify a single definition of Shinjin in Shinran's thought, so it seems to me his teaching of birth is an idea that defies easy explanation. It's much more complex than a simple explanation. So this is my way of approaching Shinran's insight, in particular to these two issues that I mentioned before, what I'm calling the immediate attainment of birth, which is a translation of a Japanese phrase, soku toku ojo, which we'll talk about, and birth in the Pure Land. So I believe Shinran had a very unique, a very revolutionary insight into birth. And it seems to me, this is just the way that I've come to understand it, his understanding was framed within, I believe, 8 different perspectives. Okay. One is his full recognition of birth within the Pure Land Buddhist tradition. He was a Pure Land Buddhist, okay? And I think he clearly was positioned within that tradition. At the same time, it's based on a solid grounding in the Mahayana foundations of Pure Land Buddhism. He was also a Mahayana Buddhist. And I believe his understanding, his experience of Pure Land Buddhism, his insight into Pure Land Buddhism was based upon this Mahayana foundations or principles. Shinran also had insight into the benefit known as entry into the ranks of the truly settled. We'll talk about that. He also had a radical interpretation of the passage on the fulfillment of the 18th vow. All this stuff is sounding pretty technical, and it is, as I said, this today's talk is going to be very much textually oriented, but we'll make our way through it. And he also, I believe, his understanding was based upon his own encounter with enlightenment as activity and his understanding of the interrelationship between true SHINJIN and realization. And finally, I think this is very important, he also had a very clear-eyed recognition of the weight of our karmic bondage, the depth of our delusions and passions. And finally, I believe Shinran also offered a groundbreaking perspective on upaya, or skillful means. I think number 8 is the part we're not going to get to today. That's why I sort of left it for next time, but it's an important aspect of Shinran's thought. So let's cover the first point. First of all, Shinran's full recognition of birth within the Pure Land Buddhist tradition. So what is birth, or sometimes phrased rebirth? So I think the notion of birth or rebirth, it speaks to the very core of the Buddhist worldview and path. Samsara, or as translated into Japanese, shoji, birth and death, signifies the existential reality of transmigration, in which beings wander in karmic suffering through endless cycles of birth, death, and rebirth. The purpose of the Buddhist path of teaching, practice, and realization is to attain nirvana, the liberation from samsara, and breaking the wheel of transmigration. In the tradition of Buddhism for householders, which we've come to know as Pure Land Buddhism, the object of the path was to attain birth or rebirth in a Buddha Kshetra, a Buddha land, or in the words of Luis Gomez, Buddha's field of action. This refers to a sphere of spiritual influence, which is purified by a Buddha. It's an ideal environment, and very much in contrast to this world. So there's a very dualistic aspect to this notion of Pure Land Buddhism, but it's an ideal environment for hearing the Buddha's teaching and practicing the Bodhisattva path of enlightenment under the guidance of a Buddha. And the most well-known of those Buddha fields was the realm of Skavati, the world of utmost bliss of the Buddha Amitabha Amitayus. And upon one's passing away, one's departure or death from this human realm, one would go to be born in Amida Buddha's Pure Land of utmost bliss. Luis Gomez, he identifies the term of rebirth in the Sanskrit term upapatti, and he believes that this term was translated into Chinese as Wang Sheng, or in Japanese, Ojo. So this is what we're going to be talking about today. So what is this traditional Pure Land scheme? This is my own little image here. So we're on the left-hand side. We're the little peanut person. We're the unenlightened, ignorant being. We live in this world, in this life. And our intention as householders is eventually to attain enlightenment, but it's extremely difficult, if not impossible, for us to do that because we are not renunciants. We don't renounce our homes and families. We don't go off to a monastery and practice, meditate all day. We have families, we have jobs, we have mortgages, we have obligations. We are in an environment that's not conducive to engaging in the Buddhist practices. And so this path of Buddhism for householders imagines a land. It sets out a land, a Buddha kshetra, a Buddha realm, which is created by a bodhisattva's vows and practices, which is presided over by a Buddha who preaches the Dharma and guides beings in performance of bodhisattva practices, in which beings attain birth in another life and eventually realize supreme nirvana. That's the sort of the imagery or the framework that's set out in the traditional Pure Land scheme for householders. So according to that thought, birth in the Pure Land meant that a practitioner would be able to reach the 41st stage of bodhisattvahood, the first stage, also known as the stage of non-retrogression, and also referred to as the stage or rank of the truly settled followers of the Mahayana. And in that environment, one would be able to engage in bodhisattva practices with the assurance that one would necessarily attain the highest enlightenment in a future life. That's the scheme. And so for Pure Land Buddhists throughout the ages, there needed to be a path through which householder Buddhists could attain birth in Amida Buddha's land. And that path was for many Pure Land Buddhists through many eons of time. The 18th vow of the largest sutra, which we know as the primal vow, or sometimes the original vow. And it states this. This is a rendition from the collected works of Shinran. If, when I attain Buddhahood, the sentient beings of the 10 quarters, with sincere mind and trusting themselves, aspiring to be born in my land, and saying my name perhaps even 10 times, should not be born there, may I not attain the supreme enlightenment. Excluded are those who commit the 5 grave offenses and those who slander the right Dharma. So within the text of the vow, these 3 minds, with sincere mind, entrusting themselves, aspiring to be born in my land. Okay, this is the threefold mind of the 18th vow. And those beings with that mind, saying my name, perhaps even 10 times, will be born in my land. That's the vow of the Bodhisattva. The next point that I wanted to raise is that I believe Shinran had a very deep understanding of and a very solid grounding in the Mahayana foundations of Pure Land Buddhism. He was thoroughly fluent in Mahayana Buddhist philosophy and practice. That insight contributed to his reformulation of the Pure Land path of enlightenment and the perspective on the unfolding wisdom as compassion. I believe what we draw from this is that Shinran understood that the Pure Land is not some intermediate stage on the path to enlightenment, as it was visualized or viewed by many Pure Land Buddhists, but it's rather the realm of enlightenment itself. And thus attainment of birth in the Pure Land after death becomes synonymous with the attainment of supreme nirvana. Shinran says this in his major work, this chapter on the true Buddha and land, reverently contemplating the true Buddha and the true land, I find that the Buddha is the Tathagata of inconceivable light, and the land is also the land of immeasurable light. Okay, so this is very interesting. His insight and his understanding of Buddha, Amida Buddha, is inconceivable light, and the Pure Land is immeasurable light. So I think we can draw a number of conclusions from this statement. One of them is that I believe Shinran makes no distinction between the true Buddha and land. Neither does he seem to take Amida as some sort of personified expression or the Pure Land to be an environmental expression of enlightenment. In other words, Shinran does not adopt the classic Pure Land Buddhist approach that seemed to attribute physical features to Amida Buddha in that Buddha's land. Rather, in his thought, both Buddha and land are significant as inconceivable light and emerge as the dynamic, compassionate activity of the ultimate reality. we'll move on. I'll come back to the Mahayana aspects of his thought as we move through this. The third point that I believe gives us a sense of the framework through which Shinran Shonin developed his thought on Shinjin and birth is his insight into the benefit of something called entry into the ranks of the truly settled. This is a very well-known status or position or description of beings who are born in the Pure Land. And as a Pure Land Buddhist, Shinran recognized that throughout the history of Pure Land Buddhism, this status or this rank, this entry into the ranks of the truly settled was considered to be a benefit realized upon birth in the Pure Land. And so under the scheme that we presented to you earlier, it meant that to be born in the Pure Land meant to be able to have be an environment where one could practice and eventually attain enlightenment. However, something's going on here. I'm going to have to get out of here because my Siri has intruded in my talk here. Sorry about that. Okay, we're back. So the idea is that upon birth in the Pure Land, one's eventual enlightenment is settled. It's settled, it's established that one will eventually attain enlightenment. And so this was always seen as a benefit or a status, a rank of those who are born in the Pure Land after death. Shinran recognized that, but at the same time, he realized that entry into the ranks of the truly settled is a benefit of Shinjin realized in the present life. So I'm going to skip over this for a little bit if I could. Basically, these are the two, this is the 11th vow of the larger sutra, which Shinran sets out as being fundamental to his understanding of realization. So the upper box is the passage of the 11th vow, which is called the vow of the necessary attainment of nirvana. And it says, if when I attain Buddhahood, the sentient beings and devas in my land do not dwell among the settled and necessarily attain nirvana, may I not attain the supreme enlightenment. So that is to dwell among the settled is what's the important benefit of being born in the Pure Land. And in the passage declaring the fulfillment of that vow, it says, the sentient beings born in that land, being the Buddha's land, all dwell among the truly settled. Okay, so this is a very clear statement. So here, these are the sort of concepts we're looking at here. This new Shōjōju entry into the ranks of the truly settled to become one within Mahayana practitioners for whom enlightenment is truly settled. It's established. And then the second concept being presented here is Futaiten, or Avaivartika in Sanskrit, that is the stage of non-retrogression, that one will never turn back, one will never retrogress or fall back on the path. It's only forward from now on. So these are the sort of ideas that were presented. And once again, in the traditional Pure Land scheme, the idea is that one would be born in the Pure Land at the moment of death, and upon birth in that Buddha land would attain entry into the ranks of true settlement, attain the stage of non-retrogression. Those are the two concepts we just talked about. Also the necessary attainment of nirvana, and realize the stage of the equal of complete enlightenment. All of these were considered to be ranks or benefits attained by the person who's born in the Pure Land. Shinran, however, took a very different view, or a unique view, let me say that. As he says here in the chapter on realization, when foolish beings possess the blind passions, he's talking about us, okay? The multitudes caught in birth and death, that is those of us dwelling within endless cycles of transmigration in samsara, defiled by evil karma, that we're bound by karma, when we who are unenlightened beings in this world realize the mind and practice that Amida Buddha directs to us, that is Shinjin and Nembutsu, they immediately join the truly settled of the Mahayana. Immediately, without the passing of any time or days, such beings of Shinjin and Nembutsu immediately join the truly settled of the Mahayana. Okay. This was Shinran's insight. So this is his unique understanding, okay, that foolish beings who realize true Shinjin attain the benefit of being able to immediately join the truly settled of the Mahayana in this life, here and now. So we have a very different scheme that's being presented by Shinran in his, what I call the reformulation of the Pure Land scheme, his appreciation, his inheriting of the Pure Land tradition, but now through the filter based on the principles of Mahayana Buddhism. And so for Shinran, what is important now is this not so much the moment of death, but it's the moment of Shinjin, okay, for the little peanut person, okay? In this world, in this life, the person of Shinjin, who has realized Shinjin, in whom Shinjin has arisen, immediately realize entry into the ranks of true settlement, the stage of non-retrogression, the necessary attainment of nirvana, the stage of equal to complete enlightenment. All of these were considered to be benefits or ranks of the persons born in the Pure Land after death. For Shinran now, these are descriptors of the life, the heart, the mind, the attainment, the realization of the person of Shinjin. And then after death, he says, in the true fulfilled land, the land of immeasurable light, one realizes inconceivable birth and attains great complete nirvana. Okay, so birth in the Pure Land means now realizing nirvana. And so it would stand to reason then, in this life, then entry into the ranks of true settlement means one becomes truly settled in the fact that one will attain enlightenment or realize nirvana, okay? And that this path we won't retrogress, we don't go back on this path, okay? So this is sort of the scheme now that Shinran presents. Along with all of this is sort of a long thing, but I'll just talk about this. He also talks about the 10 benefits of Shinjin that are realized in this life, okay? This is in his chapter on Shinjin. He says, at the one thought moment of Shinjin, he says, when we realize the diamond-like true mind, that's another way of talking about Shinjin, we transcend crosswise the paths of the 5 courses and 8 hindered existences. We break through the karmic bondage that will bind us to continue to dwell in samsara. And we will unfailingly gain 10 benefits in this present life. What are the 10? I'll skip to the first 9. We've talked about that in other talks. But the 10th is the benefit of entering the stage of the truly settled. Okay. And so this becomes the 10th. And it's said in Shin scholarship that this is the overarching benefit. This is the benefit within which all of the other benefits are contained. So the entry into the ranks, the stage of the truly settled, brings about a number of different levels and kinds of benefits within the heart and mind and the life of the person of Shinjin. Now, this is just aside for those of you who are sort of Buddhist studies geeks out there. It's said that his scheme of the 10 benefits realized in the present life was probably drawn from the 10 sublime benefits in this world, which presented in this text by the Chinese scholar Qiyun or Zuyun. Anyway, I'll just put that out there for you, those of you who enjoy that kind of thing. So I think I'll skip over that because I just talked about it. And moreover, Shinran has a very unique understanding about this benefit of entry into the ranks of true settlement. Okay, basically he's saying this is a benefit one realizes for the person who realizes Shinjin and aspires to be born in the Pure Land, and for the person who has already attained birth. And so there's the distinction that we would normally make with our conventional thinking when we make distinctions between this realm and that realm, between birth and death, is overcome. Okay. In other words, for Shinran, true attainment means that beings who realize Shinjin here and now and beings born in the Pure Land both dwell among the settled and necessarily attain nirvana. And since that realization is completely directed to us through Amida's vow and is not the result of our practice or attainment, it implies there's this twofold structure. attainment. So Shinran, in other words, he's going deeper into what it means. What does it mean to enter into the ranks of true settlement, to be truly settled in the realization that one will attain enlightenment. Okay, and what does that mean, and how do we fully appreciate that? Okay, I think that's what Shinran begins to work through in his text. Okay, so this is sort of a summary of it. It seems to me, my understanding is that for what he tells us is that realization on the path to enlightenment is the ultimate fruition of supreme nirvana that arises in the present life and also after death. So the apparent duality between life and death, which is based upon our conventional or linear thinking, is completely transcended. And not only that, but realization does not merely arise in a single direction. The true Pure Land path comprehends a movement from samsara to nirvana, and also a return from nirvana to samsara. This is then indication of sort of the Shinran's integration of his understanding of the principles of Mahayana Buddhism in his formulation of the Pure Land path. So anyway, moving on, we'll hopefully return to some of these issues. Another aspect that I think brings about Shinran's unique understanding of birth is his reinterpretation of a passage on the fulfillment of the 18th vow, the largest sutra. This is a very important point, and this is the point that I think most people in Shin studies really gravitate toward or really focus upon. And so we'll kind of walk through this thinking right now. Okay, so Shinran's rendering of the passage on the fulfillment of the 18th vow states that beings who have heard the name, realize one thought moment of Shinjin and joy, which he says is directed to them from Amida's true, sincere mind, they immediately attain birth, soku toku ojo, okay, and dwell in the stage of non-retrogression. This is the passage here. So just sort of as a review for everyone, in the larger sutra of the Buddha of Immeasurable Life, which is really the central sutra, the foundational sutra, Pure Land Buddhism and Jodo Shinshu, there is, of course, this narrative that is presented in which the Shakyamuni Buddha tells of the Dharmakara Bodhisattva, okay, who aspired to attain enlightenment and made 48 great vows. And included within the 48 great vows was the 18th vow that we talked about earlier. And so these are the Bodhisattva making the vows. Then the narrative says, and the Bodhisattva then engaged in Bodhisattva practices with a pure mind for endless kalpas of time, and perfected those practices and established or fulfilled those vows. And so he became Amida Buddha. That's the story of the larger sutra. In the latter portion of that sutra, Shakyamuni Buddha goes on to say, and those vows were fulfilled. And here, in this instance, this is the meaning of, or this is the manifestation of the fulfillment of the 18th vow, okay? We talked about that before, how beings with sincere mind and trusting in the Buddha and desire to be born in the land, saying the name even 10 times, will be born in the Pure Land. Okay, that's the vow, and that vow has been fulfilled, and this is how it's expressed in the sutra. Okay, all sentient beings, as they hear the name, realize even one thought moment of Shinjin and joy, which is directed to them from Amida's sincere mind, and aspiring to be born in that land, they then attain birth and dwell in the stage of non-retrogression. Shinran took particular interest in this passage. It was very, very important to him because he realized that it really holds within it the significance of birth, the significance of realization, the significance of attainment in Pure Land Buddhism. So he talks about this, and particularly he focuses in on this phrase, soku toku ojo. You see the Chinese characters and the romanization, and this translation, immediate attainment of birth. And for the Shinran, this became a pivotal concept. It was from this idea and his reflections and his insights into it that he was able to develop his notion of birth, Shinjin and birth. Okay, so he states here, this is a long quote, I won't read the whole thing. We find that stated the significance of they then attain birth. That's how CWS translates Sokutoku Ojo. That's sort of their own gloss. Okay, they then attain birth. That is to become established in the stage of the truly settled, thus is itself to dwell in the stage of non-retrogression. So he begins to sort of look at this. And what we can see here in this text, that he begins to, in a way, look at this phrase in a very unique way, okay? One of the big questions that we'll talk about later on, as we get to the end of this talk, I'll introduce you to some perspectives on birth in Shin Buddhism. And one thing it probably is not going to be a surprise to you that there's a whole range of perspectives, and there's a great amount of debate as to just what Shinran's teaching of birth really was or really is and what it means. And that sort of stands to reason when, scholars of any ilk get together, there's always going to be a debate. Or when people of, in the religious world gather together, there's always going to be differences of opinion. And we would like to believe that, we all share the same understanding of Shinran's teaching, but the reality is that many of us don't, and that many of us, even those of us within the BCA, have different perspectives or different understandings of Shinjin and birth. And so this has led to some very interesting sort of conversations or discussions or debates. I'll talk about some of them at the end of this talk, if I could. But here you see Shinran also working with this idea. What does the sutra mean when it says the immediate attainment of birth? Because if you take this phrase literally, it means beings who realize Shinjin immediately attain birth in the Pure Land, here and now, in this world. But then Shinran, when he considers it, you can see he's kind of working with it, but in a very sort of a unique way, okay? It seems to me that what is going on here is that rather than sort of just take this initial kind of literal or superficial understanding of this phrase, they then attain birth, I think he's trying to consider what it means in terms of religious life, in terms of spiritual reality, in terms of the journey that one travels as a person of the Nembutsu. And he begins to sort of savor and sort of massage this phrase, they then attain birth, or the immediate attainment of birth. And he comes to understand it as the phrase, this phrase for him came to mean that beings of Shinjin, persons of Shinjin, become established in the stage of the truly settled, or dwell in the stage of non-retrogression, here and now in this life. Okay. And once again, this is sort of, I gave you this image before, but you can see what he's beginning to work with is he's looking at, this is the descriptor of a person of Shinjin. This is how he understands it, both logically, doctrinally, textually, and in terms of his own experience, which differs from the tradition of Pure Land path, but it's kind of putting it into this perspective. So the immediate attainment of birth, then, he takes to mean these phrases and this reality, this religious reality for the person of Shinjin living here and now, in contrast to attaining complete nirvana in the Pure Land in the life to come. Okay, and so we'll kind of return to this when we look at the various perspectives, both from an orthodox and heterodox perspective. Again, Shinran was very, very concerned with this. Okay, he took this up in another text where he says, to be born immediately, then is to dwell in the stage of non-retrogression. To dwell in the stage of non-retrogression is to become established in the stage of the truly settled. And when does this occur? In here, the idea of immediacy or soku is taken in a temporal aspect. It means immediately, without any passage of time, without any passage of days. This becomes the religious reality for the person of Shinjin immediately, okay, without any gap in time. But what does this mean? And why does he rephrase this passage, this idea of immediately attain birth in this way? Okay, this is what's going on for Shinran. Okay, so the word that we're looking at now is soku. Okay, soku is a Chinese word, a Chinese character that has multiple levels of meaning. The one that is most well known is that of equivalence. That is, it sort of is or equal to or none other than. That A soku B means A is none other than B. Sort of that's the generic sort of meaning of soku. But Shinran takes it in two different ways. First of all, he interprets it in a sense of temporal immediacy or simultaneity, as we talked about before. That the person of Shinjin, in the one thought moment of Shinjin, one attains birth in that moment. Okay, whatever that might mean. Again, we're kind of looking at this sense of what does it mean to attain birth within this context. Okay. Here, he looks at it again. Okay. In terms of immediately, without any time elapsing, without a day passing, that's soku. But soku also has another meaning he brings to it, which is sort of interesting. He's looked at some of the old classic dictionaries of the time and other texts, and he concludes that soku also means to ascend to and become established in a certain rank. That's also the meaning of soku. And then he has this really fascinating statement here. What does attain mean? Okay, we've talked about it immediately. Now look at attain. What does attain mean? He says, attain means to have attained what one shall attain. Isn't that interesting? We'll get back to that. That's kind of an interesting play with time, don't you think? To have attained what one shall attain. Okay. To have attained is a past perfect sense. One shall attain is a perfect sense or a future sense. So one has already attained what one shall attain. Let's think about what that might imply. Okay. And then he also pairs it together with this notion of sesshu fusha, of being grasped and never abandoned, which is a well-known phrase or idea within Pure Land Buddhism. And he concludes in this way: when we are grasped by Amida immediately, without a moment or a day elapsing, we ascend to and become established in the stage of the truly settled. This is the meaning of attain birth. So maybe if I could pull back a little bit and again, kind of consider what's going on here within the context of the passage on the fulfillment of the 18th vow, the primal vow. There's this phrase that beings of Shinjin, in the one thought moment of Shinjin, immediately attain birth. And Shinran begins to sort of consider what that means or what that implies. And he is saying what he gathers from this, okay, is not so much looking at this in a literal sense, but perhaps maybe if I can impose my own language, maybe he's taking this as a term of art, or maybe he's looking at it as a sort of a technical term here, that immediately attain birth and is a sort of a phrase he's taking as a phrase of art. Okay, that means we're grasped by Amida immediately, and we ascend to and become established in the stage of the truly settled. That is to say, we realize with a fullness of heart, from the bottom of our hearts, that our enlightenment is assured, our enlightenment is settled. Okay. So this is where we're sort of, why I was saying the idea of birth in Shinran gets a little bit tricky. Okay. A little bit, maybe tricky is the wrong word, a little complex, a little bit, we have to delve into it to get the sense of it. in the future, hopefully I won't blab on too long, and we'll get to a point where we're going to be able to look at some of the various points of view or perspectives on Shinjin and birth in Shin Buddhist studies. And I think what we can see is, in many ways, the distinctions that are raised, or the differences of opinion that are raised, we can really attribute to a large extent to the sort of method that we bring to this question, or maybe the hermeneutical approach that we bring to this question. If our perspective is purely historical, we say, well, there's this history of Pure Land Buddhism, the history of Mahayana, and this is what led up to Shinran's thinking. This is how we understand Shinran based upon that historical analysis. We may come up with one sort of idea or one opinion. Or if we look purely at the world within the text, we look at Shinran's writings. What does he say here? What does he say here? How do they interrelate? How do these texts sort of work together or not work together? What does he mean by selecting this word? What does this footnote mean? You know, all of these are very detailed, specific, minute kind of questions that reflect a particular person's orientation. And if that's the chief or sole approach that one takes to this question, we may come up with a different opinion. Or another person may understand all of that, but also move into the world in front of the text and try to get a sense of, what does this mean here and now? How do I understand it? What does this imply or signify for a person living today, a person struggling with the challenges of this life? And what does this mean for the world today? So those are sort of different approaches or different orientations. And to a large extent, I believe, sort of differences that we see in the approaches or perspectives to the issue of birth can really be attributed to different approaches or different methodologies. We'll talk about that a little bit in a little while. Anyway, well, I don't know how I got into that. So this sense then of soku-toku, immediately attain, brings in Shinran's thoughts notions of immediacy and settlement in the realization in the present life. Okay, so I think I skipped over something I meant to skip. Okay, let me go back. I meant to talk about something. It's kind of interesting in this analysis, if you look at it, if you look at Shinran's texts, if you look at his discussion of this phrase, immediately attain birth, he gives great emphasis on immediacy or soku, or ascending to a rank, and also to attain, where he says attain means to have attained what one shall attain. Okay, so in Japanese is ubeki koto wo etari, ubeki koto wo etari, which is one already has attained what one will attain in the future. Okay, what does this mean? And so this is an interesting sort of point that also comes up in the various points of view or perspectives, opinions as to the notion of birth. Those who wish to conclude that what Shinran is talking about is that in this life, we hear the name and gain the assurance of birth in the Pure Land, then this phrase, have attained what one shall attain, is a way of talking about being assured. One is assured that we'll attain enlightenment in the future. We've attained that assurance, okay? Others, however, look upon this as a sort of a paradoxical use of time and tense, okay? We've already attained what we haven't yet attained. Or maybe rephrasing this sense of attainment is already, but not yet. We've already attained birth, but not yet, okay? And this sort of tension between the two. We've already attained it, but we haven't yet attained it. We've already attained what we haven't yet attained is a real interesting way of perhaps pulling back or forcing us to pull back from um, our biases, our willingness to look at time in purely in terms of past, present, and future, of saying, well, something either had to have happened already or it will happen in the future. It has to be one of the two. But Shinran, it perhaps is based on his Mahayana understanding, is pulling us away from that sort of prejudiced view, that biased view of looking at reality in terms of time, past, present, and future, and considering what attainment is as transcending time, transcending our conventional ideas of time. That's another perspective that some scholars bring to this. So it's interesting, okay? But what's finally interesting in this whole area that I want to just let you know about is that Shinran doesn't analyze birth, okay? He talks about immediacy, he talks about ascending to a rank, talks about attainment, but he doesn't talk about birth. I think that's a real fascinating sort of omission, or perhaps an intentional omission. Okay, I spent too much time on all this. Sorry about that. I'm going to jump ahead. So another point that I think it's important for us to consider as we understand Shinran's perspective on Shinjin and birth is that he has what I believe, he engages in a radical departure from traditional Pure Land thought. And that departure is grounded upon his encounter with enlightenment as activity, his encounter with formless Dharma body as suchness, which takes form as Dharma body as compassionate means. This is a bit of a maybe a confusing and complex perspective, but it's one that I think very important for us to understand Shinran, okay? This quotation that I give you here, this is actually Donran, and Shinran cites it in his major work in the chapter on realization, when Donran and Tanwan talks about the twofold Dharma body, okay, that the twofold Dharma body comes about with the interfusion of formless truth and truth as form, okay. And he talks about how Dharma body has this twofold sense, okay. Rather than read through it, which is kind of a complicated one, I'll just give you my little graphic here, which I think is easier to understand, okay. So the idea is that Dharma body is twofold. Dharma body is the Dharma body as suchness, which is Japanese hosho hoshin, which Shinran describes as has neither color nor form. Thus the mind cannot grasp it, nor words describe it. So Dharma body, or using the term Buddha here, Tathagata, this is described as Dharma body as suchness itself. It's formless. It doesn't have any color. If we try to grasp it or comprehend it, if we try to talk about it or explain it, we will fail, because it transcends, it goes beyond our conventional way of thinking, it goes beyond language, okay, by its very nature. And so this is one aspect, one of the Dharma bodies that's being discussed here, formlessness. But what good would formlessness be if it's just that? What good would this, what sort of impact would this have upon the lives of people struggling to get by, people who are wishing to try to understand what's true and real and meaningful in life? What impact might that formlessness have upon our lives? It would have none. And so, because of its formlessness, this Dharma body gives rise to form. That's the nature of suchness. Suchness is formless, but because it is formless, it gives rise to form. And this is in this idea is referred to as the Dharma body as compassionate means, Hoben Hoshin. Shinran Shonin, he describes it in this way: from this oneness was manifested form, called Dharma body as compassion means. It is none other than Amida Tathagata. Okay, so Amida Buddha in Shinran's, what he learns from Tanwan, is this Dharma body as compassionate means. Okay, or to put it in another way, Dharma body as suchness is a reference to wisdom. Okay, the wisdom that that is able to perceive the fundamental reality of all existences, the non-duality of all existences, the formlessness of truth itself. But formless wisdom by itself is ineffective and useless. And so it gives rise to form. Wisdom arises as compassion. It arises as compassion taking form, making itself known to beings. This is Amida Buddha. And this, more specifically, is the name of Amida Buddha, Shinran will say. And so this idea then of the Tathagata, that is the Dharma body of suchness, giving rise, which is formless, giving rise to form, is this fundamental reality of enlightenment. It is the working of enlightenment, the activity of enlightenment. And this activity of wisdom arising as compassion, it arises within samsara to awaken beings, us like us, foolish, ignorant, unenlightened beings, to itself. Or Shinran says, taking a name, making itself known to beings. It's Namo Amida Butsu. So this is Shinran's encounter, and I believe that encounter was very, very important to his understanding of birth. We'll come back to that, okay? Another factor which was really important for Shinran is his understanding of what that Buddha activity implies in its dynamic interrelationship between Shinjin and realization. So this is one of the implications of his encounter with wisdom arising as compassion, okay? So what Shinran does is he's sort of takes this traditional sort of pillars of the Buddhist path, teaching, practice, and realization. One learns the teaching, one puts them into practice, and then one awakens to the truth embodied within the teachings. That's sort of idea of the traditional notion of teaching, practice, and realization. But Shinran, in his encounter with wisdom unfolding as compassion, undertakes now what I call a radical reinterpretation of the notion of realization or the notion of birth in Amida Buddha's Pure Land of Bliss. Okay, and so one of the ways that we talked about earlier is that Shinran indicated is that for him, the Pure Land is not some intermediate realm. It's not some beautiful paradise with all these beautiful trees and lakes and jeweled ponds that lies in some intermediate space between our unenlightened realm and enlightenment. Okay, it's not simply that as it was characterized in Pure Land Buddhism. Rather, for Shinran, it's the land of immeasurable light and life, what implies both spatial and temporal infinity, or more precisely, it is the truth and reality itself, the realm of enlightenment. And so this is sort of a this is a phrase that I introduced to you before, that the Pure Land is the land of immeasurable light. Okay, it's a realm of supreme nirvana. As such, it transcends samsaric existence, and yet, again, grounded with the Mahayana principles, it's not separate from samsara. It pervades the hearts and minds of all beings in the 10 directions, bringing all to the attainment of enlightenment. This is a very famous passage that Shinran has in one of his texts, Notes on Essentials of Faith Alone, when he talks about nirvana. And he goes through this sort of litany of equivalences. Nirvana is extinction of passions, etc. It's also Tathagata. It's also Buddha nature. He says, this Tathagata pervades the countless worlds. It fills the hearts and minds of the ocean of all beings. Thus plants, trees, and land all attain Buddhahood. This activity of enlightenment, of wisdom unfolding as compassion, it pervades the countless worlds. It fills all of our hearts and minds, okay, of all beings, all living beings and all beings that are are animate and inanimate, okay? Thus plants, trees, and land all attain Buddhahood. This is this very broad and dynamic and sort of universal sense of the activity of enlightenment, or the activity, the reaching out of the Pure Land. Having said all of this, Shinran also brought a very clear-eyed understanding of the weight of our karmic bondage, the depth of our delusions and passions that we harbor throughout our lives. So although Shinran spoke about the immediate attainment of birth in this life, he did not assert that one attains Buddhahood, Jobutsu, or realizes nirvana in this life. We don't find that in Shinran's writing or in his thought. Instead, what Shinran offers are different descriptors or appellations to the person of Shinjin. He says, the person of Shinjin is the same as Maitreya, is equal to the Tathagatas. These are phrases he uses to talk about the person of Shinjin here now in this life. So the first one is the same as Maitreya, Jinyo Miroku. Shinran cites another Pure Land scholar, which talks about the persons of the Nembutsu being the same as Maitreya. He draws upon that, okay? And then he says the person of Shinjin is the same as Maitreya. I think all of you are familiar with Maitreya Bodhisattva. So this is sort of a summary. Maitreya Bodhisattva is the person or the Bodhisattva dwelling in the stage next to enlightenment, in Tushta heaven. And according to Buddhist legends and cosmology, when some 5,670,000,000 years have passed, Maitreya will definitely attain supreme enlightenment and become the next Buddha in this Saha world. Okay, so the next Buddha in this Saha world will be Maitreya. Okay, that's the idea of Maitreya is the Buddha in waiting. Okay, so when Shinran talks about the person of Shinjin as same as Maitreya, in a sense, he's talking about the person as being a Buddha in waiting. Okay, what does this mean? It means, in a sense, that the person of Shinjin will definitely attain supreme nirvana at the end of this life. Okay, so here is a longer phrase. I won't. Well, it's kind of lyrical, so it's kind of this language is kind of nice. So I'll read through it. Truly, we know that because Mahasattva Maitreya has perfectly realized the diamond-like mind of the stage equal to enlightenment. That's sort of that's the discussion of Maitreya we just had. He will without fail attain the stage of supreme enlightenment beneath the dragon flower tree at the dawn of the three assemblies. So that's the Maitreya narrative. Okay, and then he says, because sentient beings of the Nembutsu have perfectly realized the diamond-like mind of crosswise transcendence. That's a long way of talking about Shinjin. They transcend and realize great complete nirvana on the eve of the moment of death. Hence the words as such the same. So he's drawing saying that this is the same situation. The person of Shinjin will transcend this Saha world, realize great complete nirvana on the eve of the moment of death, just like Maitreya. He also uses another phrase, which he draws from the Avatamsaka Sutra, equal to the Tathagatas, Nyorai Toshitoshi. And what seems to be a straightforward sort of description of the person of Shinjin is not necessarily so, because for Shinran, persons of Shinjin might be the same as Maitreya, who will definitely attain supreme enlightenment, but persons of Shinjin are not the same as the Tathagatas. They are equal to them. Now, this is a little bit tricky. Some of you are saying, well, it's the same word. It means the same thing, right? Well, not necessarily. There's a distinction to be made here. Although perhaps as English speakers, we don't perceive much difference between same as and equal to us in the same meaning. But perhaps, a Japanese speaker would be able to make some sort of linguistic distinctions between onaji and hitoshi. Okay. So perhaps there's a distinction that can be made, or if we wanted to play with words a little bit more, Maybe instead of translating Hitoshi as equal to, we might translate it as tantamount to, virtually the same as, very similar, yet very different from. These are sort of maybe words that would get closer to the mark. However, I think Shinran, I don't think is just playing with linguistics there. He's not playing with words. I don't think linguistics drives Shinran to offer such fine distinctions between the words. He's attempting, I believe, to give expression to the depth of our karmic evil and to the inconceivable working of the vow. For instance, he says here, as far as beings who are the same as Maitreya and equal to the Tathagatas. So maybe I'll just read through it. Okay. Now the largest sutra speaks of the stage next to enlightenment, like Maitreya. Since Maitreya is already close to Buddhahood, it is the custom in various schools to speak of him as Maitreya Buddha. Since those counted among the truly settled are of the same stage as Maitreya, they are said to be equal to the Tathagatas. Know that the persons of true Shinjin can be called the equal of the Tathagatas because, and here's the payoff, even though they themselves are always impure and creating karmic evil, their hearts and minds are already equal to the Tathagatas. It's kind of a fascinating statement here. This is from one of his letters from the Lamp of the Latter Ages. The persons of Shinjin can be called the equal of Tathagatas because even though they are impure and creating karmic evil, their hearts and minds are already equal to the Tathagatas. Is he making a distinction between mind and body here? Is that what's happening? Kind of an interesting phrase that Shinran writes, interesting sort of expressions that Shinran puts within these letters. So what do we draw from this in terms of, and what does this mean in terms of a person of Shinjin who realize the immediate attainment of birth, okay? What does it mean in terms of birth in the Pure Land? I think Shinran's deep perception of human nature probably made it impossible for him to make unrealistic assertions about human attainment. Even persons of Shinjin, therefore, cannot attain Buddhahood in this body or in this life. The person of Shinjin remains an ordinary foolish being despite one's immediate attainment of birth. As long as we continue to live as human beings, we'll be full of ignorance and blind passions, generating karmic evil until the last breath leaves us, as this well-known passage expresses. This is a famous passage that Shinran writes, okay? Foolish beings, as expressed in the parable of the two rivers of water and fire, we are full of ignorance and blind passion. Our desires are countless, and anger, wrath, jealousy, and envy are overwhelming, arising without pause. To the very last moment of life, they do not cease or disappear or exhaust themselves, okay? This is one half of a very famous passage from Shinran. I didn't put the second part in. This is the tough one. This is the tough one to read, the tough one to hear, the tough one to think about, because this is a descriptor of us. Earlier in this text, Shinran says, foolish being bombu refer to us. Okay, he's talking about us, okay? So when you see foolish beings, he's talking about us, ignorant beings. And this is how he describes us based upon his own deep self-examination reflection. This is how he's describing himself. And I think he's encouraging us to reflect upon ourselves as well and look within our own hearts and to recognize that perhaps isn't this also an apt description. Anyway, so this is how Shinran, perceived himself and sentient beings. And so it stands to reason, how could such beings as this even deign to be called Buddhas? How could we even take it upon ourselves to say that we realize Buddhahood in this life? Okay, I'm taking too much time, so I'm going to move ahead if that's okay. The next portion I want to talk about is, okay, we've been talking about the immediate attainment of birth in this life. What does birth in the Pure Land mean? Okay, let's talk about that a little bit if we could. Or how does Shinran think about it? Okay, so first of all, according to traditional Pure Land thought, birth in the Pure Land meant that one reached the stage of non-retrogression and dwelled among the truly settled of the Mahayana. We've talked about that. In that environment, one would be able to engage in bodhisattva practices with the assurance that one would necessarily attain the highest enlightenment in a future life. Okay, so that, again, in the traditional Pure Land thought, the Pure Land or the Buddha Kshetra of Amida Buddha is just perfect environment where through hearing the Dharma, receiving the guidance of Amida, engaging in Bodhisattva practices, we would not retrogress. We never fall back. We would become settled in the realization that we would attain enlightenment in a future life. Okay. However, Shinran states that the Pure Land is not some intermediate stage on the path to enlightenment, but is the land of immeasurable light, which you saw earlier. This is enlightenment itself. Thus, attainment of birth in the Pure Land after death becomes synonymous with the attainment of supreme nirvana. That's what we gather from Shinran. Again, this is the same thing I put up third time. But anyway, so this portion we're looking at now, being born in the true fulfilled land, inconceivable birth, Shinran calls it. Okay, one attains complete nirvana, great complete nirvana. This is the attainment of Buddhahood. That's what birth in the Pure Land means. Birth in the Pure Land after death means Buddhahood for the person of Shinjin. Okay, so there's a number of phrases that Shinran presents. It is kind of interesting, I have to say, that if you look in his major texts, there's not a lot of discussion of death. You know, it's not mentioned a lot. Okay, there are some references. We find more references in his letters, but in his major works, his Chinese and Japanese works, there's not a lot of talk about death or death being that event in which we attain birth in the Pure Land. I think it's a very interesting sort of note to make. But here is one of the instances in the chapter on Shinjin where Shinran says, because sentient beings of the Nembutsu have perfectly realized the diamond-like mind of crosswise transcendence, again, a long way of talking about Shinjin, they transcend and realize great complete nirvana on the eve of the moment of death. Okay, the eve of the moment of death. Here's another phrase which I think gives us sort of a sense of Pure Land lyricism. Okay, this is a beautiful, beautiful passage. It says, when one has boarded the ship of the vow of great compassion and sailed out on the vast ocean of light, the winds of perfect virtue blow softly and the waves of evil are transformed. The darkness of ignorance is immediately broken through, and quickly reaching the land of immeasurable light, one realizes great nirvana and acts in accord with the virtue of Samantabhadra. Let this be known. This doesn't necessarily talk about death. It's not saying that the person of Shinjin at the moment of death goes to the Pure Land. However, this is a sort of more of a lyrical, more of a poetic way of talking about this experience of birth in the Pure Land. There are a couple of other hymns that give us a sense of what maybe where Shinran is headed. They're actually both hymns from the hymns of the Pure Land, and I've taken them out of order. I do so because to me they read, or at least I gain something. Let me say that when I read these out of order. So the first one is 94, hymn number 94. It goes like this: the person who attains Shinjin and joy is taught to be equal to the Tathagatas. Great Shinjin is itself Buddha nature. Buddha nature is none other than Tathagata. This brings up a real interesting point about Buddha nature and what it means in terms of in Shin Buddhism, what position it holds, how it operates, what significance it has. There are a lot of questions about Buddha nature in Shin Buddhism. This just sort of just touches upon it. But this next hymn, which I take out of order, gives us sort of another insight, where it says, Tathagata is none other than nirvana. Nirvana is called Buddha nature. Beyond our ability to attain it in the state of foolish beings, we realize it on reaching the land of peace. Interesting, huh? So the first two lines are the litany that we already saw. Buddha nature, Tathagata, Nirvana is Buddha nature, etc. But then he says, beyond our ability to attain it in the state of foolish beings. And in this state, as we are foolish beings, ignorant beings dwelling in this Saha world, it's beyond our ability to attain Buddha nature or to become, to fully actualize our Buddha nature or to realize nirvana. but we will realize it on reaching the land of peace. I think this is an interesting way of perhaps Shinran saying that, we will know Buddha nature, we'll see Buddha nature, okay, we'll realize our Buddha nature in the Pure Land. But while we're still in the state of foolish beings, in a way, we're embraced by it. We're taken and held by it. Maybe that's a distinction that could be made. Another couple points to make in this section. Shinran relates that persons of true Shinjin who attain birth in Amida's true fulfilled land are born transformed. Kesho is known in the largest sutra. This is a miraculous birth. That's one of the translations of that, which Shinran also describes as Nanjigi Ojo, the birth that is inconceivable. Okay, so this is ways of describing birth in the Pure Land, being born transformed, miraculous birth, birth that is inconceivable. There's sort of a background of that. This is the last point that I want to touch upon before we get to the last portion of today's talk. There's a section in Shinran's major text in the chapter on practice where he cites a long passage from Tanwan. Tanwan is we mentioned his name before. He was a Chinese Pure Land master who is said in many ways sort of considered the Madhyamika and the Yogacara sort of pillars of Pure Land Buddhism and formalized more of a Pure Land philosophy, it could be said. There's a lot of discussion about Tanwan, but in any event, in Tanwan's commentary, commentary means it's a commentary on Vasubandhu's discourse or treatise on the Pure Land. And in Vasubandhu's treatise, he starts out with a gatha. He says, Sesongai shin kimyo jinjippo mugeko nyorai gancho anrakok. O world-honored one, I single-heartedly take refuge in the Tathagata, whose unhindered light fills the 10 directions, and I aspire to be born in the land of peace and bliss. Okay, that's how Vasubandhu's his treatise starts. Tanwan goes through a line-by-line commentary on the treatise, and he comes upon this word birth. Okay, Tanwan, being the Buddhist scholar, enjoys this moment and opportunity to really reflect upon birth. Okay, so his question is, this is a rhetorical question. In the Mahayana sutras and treatises, it is frequently taught that sentient beings are in the final analysis unborn, like empty space. Why does Bodhisattva Vasubandhu express his aspiration for birth? Why is this Bodhisattva, who should know better, talking about birth? Because aren't we all unborn? Isn't that what Mahayana teaches us? And Tanwan answers himself, the statement sentient beings are unborn like empty space is open to two interpretations. First, what ordinary beings see, such as sentient beings, which they conceive as real, or the acts of being born and dying, which they view as real, is ultimately non-existent, like imaginary tortoise fur, or like empty space. Second, since all things are born from causal conditions, they are actually unborn. That is, they are non-existent, like empty space. The birth to which Bodhisattva Vasubandhu aspires refers to being born through causal conditions. Hence, it is provisionally termed birth. This does not mean that there are real things or that things being born and dying is real, as ordinary beings imagine. Classic sort of Mahayanistic response. Okay, that is to say, Tanwan asks himself rhetorically, Vasubandhu speaks of aspiring for birth in Pure Land. We all know, as Mahayana Buddhists, that all existences are ultimately empty and thus unborn. Why is he asking? And Tanwan says, the notion of birth is used because although all things that ignorant beings conceive as real are ultimately unborn, we can still say that they are born. They arise out of causal conditions. That is exactly why they are unborn. So we could use the word born is like tortoise fur. It's like we could talk about tortoise fur all we like, but in reality, tortoises don't have fur. So we could use the words, we could reflect upon the concepts, but it's ultimately meaningless. That's one way in which we could look at this when Vasubandhu is sort of just tossing around the word born. But Tanwan says, no, there's a deeper meaning. What he means born is that we arise out of causal conditions. It's not like we have any substantial eternal substance or soul, but things arise, are born out of the constant flux of infinite causal conditions. So that's what Vasubandhu means, okay? And so we can provisionally use the word birth. That's the first part. Again, for you Buddhist studies geeks, this is sort of like, this is like a peanut butter and jelly sandwich. This is good stuff. And then the second one, second part of the question, Tanwan asks himself another question. In what sense do you speak of birth in the Pure Land? So here again, we're looking at the word ojo. Okay, ojo, as we talked about earlier, is a combination. It's the way in which scholars believe that was a translation of the Sanskrit upapatti. Ojo literally means to go and be born. Okay, to go and be born. To go and be born in the Pure Land. That's what ojo means. So in the first question, Tanwan took up the second character, sho or jo, to be born. Now he's taking up the first character, o. What does it mean to go? Okay, what does it mean to go to be born? And so I won't go through all of this. I'll let you read it, but just because I'm running out of time. But basically, what he comes out is this. If we're able to provisionally speak of a person who is born through causal conditions, which is the number one, what does birth in the Pure Land literally mean? O, sho, going to be born really mean? And Tanwan says this, a person of this defiled world cannot be the same as the person of the Pure Land, because that would mean there's no causality. This is pure Buddhist logic at work here. So we can't talk about a person in this world going to be born in the Pure Land. They're not the same person, because if the person in this world and the person in the Pure Land are the same, then there's no causality. Okay, it's just like a transference of entity. There's no causality here. Yet, he says, a person of this defiled world cannot be different from a person of the Pure Land, because if that were the case, there would be no continuity. Classic sort of the sort of logic play, the play of Mahayana logic. It can't be the same because there's no causality. It can't be different because there's no continuity. What does this mean? Well, a Mahayanist would conclude birth in the Pure Land, in other words, is synonymous with the attainment of prajna paramita, non-discriminative wisdom that transcends all dualities between samsara and nirvana, delusion and purity, being and non-being, going and coming, same and different, and born and unborn. That is to say, birth in the Pure Land is the realization of wisdom, of enlightenment. Okay, all of this I just give you because it's sort of interesting that Shinran cites this passage. He doesn't comment on the passage. He refers to the passage just on very few occasions, but it's an interesting one. So I just leave it at that. Okay, so I've taken all of you through a fairly confusing and meandering path to the question of birth or the attainment of birth. So let's sort of review and let's kind of go on to see what other people are saying about it, okay? So then what does the attainment of birth mean in Shinran's thought? It could be said, this is one conclusion we could make, is that he's making two general propositions. One, birth is attained immediately. Okay, within the one thought moment of the realization of Shinjin, this is the immediate attainment of birth. Okay, this means very specifically that one dwells here and now in the stage of non-retrogression and true settlement and will unfailingly attain enlightenment, okay, in the Pure Land in the life to come. That is, one has attained what one shall attain. That's what we talked about. That's sort of that very close, detailed reading that Shinran gives to this passage, Sokutoku Ojo, the immediate attainment of birth, in the passage on the fulfillment of the 18th vow. A second conclusion or proposition that he might be making is that the attainment of birth in the true fulfilled Pure Land after death is inconceivable birth, miraculous birth, birth of no birth, that which is none other than the attainment of supreme nirvana. I repeated myself, okay. So anyway, so that's another proposition I believe Shinran is making. But what do we make of that? And what does that tell us about when we ask the question, what is birth? What is the relationship between Shinjin and birth? You know, when I reflect again upon that conversation that I had with that great scholar many years ago, when he said, "Oh no, not everyone is born. My sister-in-law is not born because she didn't have faith." Okay, where, how does he come to that conclusion? And does Shinran in any way help us to understand that statement? That's sort of where we come back to. So what the point that I want to, the part that I want to talk about here is that this idea of birth is somewhat complex. And that, of course, then is just perfect ground for giving rise to debates. And so there's been a lot of debate. There continues to be debate about the nature of birth within Pure Land Buddhist or Shin Buddhist studies. Okay. Specifically here, if we can try to summarize what that debate is about, this is unfair, but let me just make it anyway. It may focus on the question of whether a person of Shinjin actually attains birth in the Pure Land immediately, or receives or attains the assurance of birth in the Pure Land in the life to come. Okay, in many ways, we see points of view that go in either direction. Okay, so I'm just going to give you a few, introduce you to a few thinkers, a few Shin Buddhist scholars who have taken various points of view. I'm going to do so without trying to sort of reveal, without trying to issue any value judgments or statements of whether I think they're right or wrong. I just want to introduce them to you for your consideration. And perhaps today we'll have a little bit of time to talk about them. But this will lead then immediately to the next talk, the next part 4 of this, when I begin to talk about Shinjin and skillful means, and then Shinjin and liberation. Okay, but let me just introduce to you a few of the thinkers. Okay, so first of all, there's what I'm perhaps unfairly calling the orthodox position within Nishu Honganji, which for the most part takes this position, that the person of Shinjin receives the assurance that one will be born in the Pure Land in the life to come. That upon realizing Shinjin, one attains the assurance that one will be born. Some of the elements to this conclusion might consist of these. The sole karmic cause of birth is the name of Amida, which is the embodiment of all dharmic virtues. That cause becomes fulfilled when the name is heard and the true mind is received in the one thought moment of Shinjin. From that moment on, one is assured that birth and enlightenment will be attained in the afterlife. Again, birth and enlightenment are synonymous. As a result, one is able to live with joyful anticipation of birth in the Pure Land in the life to come, reciting the Nembutsu as an expression of gratitude for the benevolence received. So that is how, at least in this kind, I'm rendering what I'm calling the orthodox position. Of course, that's overly simplistic. You know, there's no one particular orthodox position, but it's sort of, to me, it sort of summarizes what many of the positions we see or we would define as orthodoxy might state. Okay, there are a couple of passages from earlier scholars that reflect this position. Okay, one is from Yosho, an Edo period scholar, says, since the characters for birth, O and Jo, or O and Sho, mean that one goes to be born in that land, of course, this refers to a future benefit. Still, since attaining birth also means that one, I'm sorry, too many words here, one attains assurance, it is also explained to be a present benefit. Sorry, terrible translation, too many words. I'll read that again. Since the characters for birth mean that one goes to be born in that land, of course, this refers to a future benefit. Still, since attaining birth also means that one attains assurance, it is also said to be a present benefit. Okay, that's Yosho's position. Okay, Fugen Dayan, a well-known professor at Ryukoku University, and scholar in the 20th century, writes this in his words, Saiki no Ojo Shisho Megurite. Okay, he says, The interpretation of they then attain birth or the immediate attainment of birth, sokutoku ojo, is based on the stage of the truly settled. Thus, the stage of the truly settled refers to the group whose birth in the Pure Land is truly settled. They then attain birth must mean that then that one's birth is assured. That's the position that he takes. A very well-known scholar, priest Naito Tomoyasu, who unfortunately passed away only a couple of years ago, wrote extensively about birth, and he actually came over to BCA a number of times to give lectures and seminars on the notion of birth and Shinran's thought. So this is from his book, Shinran no Ojo Shiso. There's a lot to it, so this doesn't adequately summarize what he said, but Naito Sensei says things like this. Shinran's Pure Land Buddhism is grounded in Mahayana principles of non-duality, yet explained in terms of the duality between sentient beings, Buddha, this world, and the Pure Land. I'm sorry, a lot of typos. It's done so in order to reveal that Amida Buddha and the Pure Land saves beings who are unable to attain Buddhahood on their own. Thus, ordinary beings are unable to attain birth in the Pure Land after death. So although Pure Land Buddhism, Mahayana, Shinran's Jodo Shinshu, is grounded in Mahayana, the teachings of non-duality, that truth of non-duality is expressed dualistically, okay? So that beings will entrust in the vow, aspire to be born, beings who are unable to attain Buddhahood on their own, will be able to attain birth in the Pure Land after death. He also says, Shinran did not speak of birth in the present life, rather he speaks of the joy of dwelling in the ranks of the truly settled in this life. The meaning of immediate attainment of birth, sokutoku ojo, is that a person who entrusts in Amida Buddha enters the ranks of the truly settled and attains the stage of non-retrogression. For Naito Sensei, these are sets, these are phrases that can't be separated. Okay, sokutoku ojo juf taiten. This is one phrase, he says. You can't separate it out. Okay, so the immediate of attainment of birth equals the ranks of entering the ranks of the true settled equals attaining the stage of non-retrogression. This means that one is assured of birth, one's birth in the Pure Land after death. I also want to introduce you some non-orthodox perspectives. This is one by a scholar by the name of Toyo Engetsu. Really wrote extensively on a number of different topics with Shinshu, but he also writes here about birth. Not sure I'm going to read this through the whole thing. Well, I'll read parts of it, okay? The phrase, they then attain birth, again, sokutoku ojo, reveals that the benefit of birth has been perfectly fulfilled. As a result, the word birth naturally pervades the present life, okay? Or as he says in the middle of this passage, birth means that the cause for remaining in the three realms of samsaric existence is eliminated, okay? The cause that binds us to birth and death forever is eliminated. That's what birth means. And the result of that cause is extinguished, okay? So birth means that within the light that grasps and does not abandon us, one coincides with the wisdom of the Buddha. This meaning of birth corresponds with the present life. So we can talk about birth in the present life because birth means our bonds to continuing to dwell in transmigration have been broken through. This is a heterodox view that we hear often. I don't attribute to anyone, but it's a position that we hear often, is that in this view, the Pure Land exists here and now. And a corollary of that is that this world is really the Pure Land. We just don't know it. We can, however, attain birth here and now when we realize SHINJIN and awaken our fundamental enlightened minds. So this is a perspective we've heard and many people have taken. In many ways, this is taken as a teaching of Shin Buddhism. In many ways, it has more similarities to perhaps a Zen approach. But I think we also need to counter this, or maybe just balance this perspective with words that we find from Shinran in the special preference to the chapter on SHINJIN, where he says, but the monks and laity of this age and the religious teachers of these times are floundering in concepts of self-nature and mind only, and to disparage the true realization of enlightenment in the Pure Land way. It's said in traditional sectarian scholarship that self-nature, or the word jisho, is a reference to the teaching that all beings are fundamentally Buddhas, and yuishin, or mind only, is a reference to the teaching that the Pure Land exists within our own minds. Again, that's a sectarian interpretation of the phrase, but it is, I think, is a statement or a passage that I think needs to be considered. And then Yoshifumi Ueda Yoshifumi, or Ueda Gibun, is a very well-known Shin Buddhist scholar. He was the chief head translator of the collected works of Shinran. He also was a teacher of Dennis Hirota. They wrote many books together. He was well known for his very unorthodox presentation of the notion of birth in Shinran's thought. This is one way, my way of trying to summarize parts of it. It's a very lengthy and extensive explanation. This is just one part of it, where Ueda Sensei says, Shinran's conception of birth is non-dualistic in terms of time and space. Nirvana, timelessness, both transcends and also fills samsara, temporal existence. So timelessness fills time, okay? Birth in the Pure Land means entry into the realm of timelessness that pervades time. The immediate attainment of birth means that one has forever broken through the karmic bonds of samsara. Thus, it could be said birth has two meanings: the settlement of birth in the present life and the realization of supreme nirvana when life ends. Stated in another way, the person of Shinjin dwells at the same time both within and outside of time, along the path and at its completion, within samsara and nirvana, and in this world and in the Pure Land. This is one quotation from Ueda's book, Shinran no Ojo no Shiso, where he says, from India to China up to Honen in Japan, never once had it been said that one attains birth while still living in the present life. It was Shinran who dared to say this. Anyway, I won't read the rest, but that I'll let you read it at your leisure. This is, Ueda is, again, a very well-known scholar for making the statement that there are two forms of birth: birth in the present life and birth in the life to come. Okay, and then Shinran talked about birth in the present life. Soga Ryojin was a well-known scholar in the Higashi Honganji, the Otaniha tradition. He wrote extensively about a lot of different topics, but in this text, Shoshinge Nembutsu Choki, these notes or lectures on Shoshinge, he writes about birth. This is kind of lengthy. I won't read all of it, but I'll leave it up for you to either screen capture, or you can read it on the YouTube channel. He says, when attaining Shinjin, we live a new life. This life is what is called birth. Birth is not something that occurs after we die. When we attain Shinjin, we immediately live the life of being decisively established in birth. Let me see. I'll go down to the bottom here. This self is a body of defiled passions, therefore it exists within the Saha world. However, even though it exists within the Saha world, the mind perfectly transcends it. Thus it dwells in the Pure Land. The mind is constantly active in the world of light. It is this kind of life that is meant by birth in the Pure Land. Again, Soga's writings are extensive. There's not a lot of English translations. I don't know if this book has been translated in English. There are some translations of Soga that have been done by Higashi Honganji scholars and ministers. Anyway, there's he's also always a stimulating read. It's interesting that in Naito's book, he takes great pains to critique Soga, Ueda, and another person by the name of Matsuno Junko, and their perspectives on birth. So I think Naito's book is an interesting one because it's very detailed, it's very logical, very analytical, and he makes a point of taking on some of the viewpoints that are, at least within Nishu Honganji, viewed as heterodox. And finally, my teacher and Reverend Harada's teacher, Shigaragi Sensei, has another specific viewpoint regarding birth. And I'll read through this, and then there's a quotation as well. So his Shinran's emphasis on birth in the immediate present is grounded on his understanding of Shinjin. This is Shigaragi's fundamental perspective. Shinjin is both the experience of awakening, which is expressed as true knowing or Shinchi, and the experience of an encounter with truth and reality, which is expressed as true mind, Shin-Shin. The person of Shinjin means the one dwells in the supramundane world that transcends the secular world, even as one resides in the very midst of the secular Sahara world, very similar to what Soga was saying, and also Toyo Engetsu. The life of the person of Shinjin is one of simultaneous contradiction. One is a foolish, evil being who is settled within enlightened reality. Such a person will unfailingly reach the Pure Land and realize the same enlightenment as Amida Buddha. Thus, although the person of Shinjin is not a Tathagata, such a person could be said to be equal to the Tathagatas. And Shigaragi writes this. This is from his text Shinran Yokeru Shin no Kenkyu, a study of Shin in Shinran's thought. This is a lengthy one, so I'll just read a portion of this as we close this talk. Where should I start? Entrusting oneself to the primal vow means that in the preceding moment, one's false, deluded life comes to an end. He's citing a passage from the Gutoku show, Gutoku's notes, and he's making a comment on that. He says, immediately attaining birth, soku toku ojo, means that accordingly, one is immediately born into a new life of the Tathagata the very next moment. And so he talks about that. Then in that regard, Shinran speaks here as well about the immediate attainment of birth in the present life as a benefit of Shinjin. So this is a point of view that grounded in Shigaragi's perspective on Shinran's teaching of Shinjin, which in a manner sort of paralleling that of Toyo Engetsu, Ueda, and even Soga, talking about that this breaks through the bonds of our existence of transmigration, and this could be termed birth. Anyway, so that's about it for now. It's the end of part 3, and I'll ask all of you to please join me in Gassho. Gassho, please. Namo Amida Butsu. Namo Amida Butsu. Namo Amida Butsu. Namo Amida Butsu.